Microdosing for health, healing, and enhanced performance. Today's episode, I'm talking to Jordan Gruber, who also co-authored Your Symphony of Selves with Fadiman, and they've got a new book out, him and James Fadiman, on microdosing. I got to get a sneak peek ahead of time, y'all. It is an incredible book. If you're new to microdosing or you're already working with microdosing, I think this is the new guide that everyone needs to have. So check out today's episode where we're going to talk about not only the research that they had, but how microdosing is contributing to people's lives. So check out today's episode with me and Jordan Gruber, who is the co-author of Microdosing for Health, Healing, and Enhanced Performance with James Fadiman.
Whether you're a life coach, therapist, biohacker, invested in wellness, or in the healthcare profession, if you have an intention to work in psychedelic spaces, you're in the right place then. If you're called, get involved. But first, get informed. Let's talk the 4 N's: intake, intention, in-space integration, leading to deeper transformations. Psychedelic Coach Podcast, Todd Cole. Walk you through the process, it's all possible. Leave space for the follow-through. Most importantly, integration is not optional.
Jordan, I knew because of other books you've written that this was going to be something the podcast would love. But before we even get to that, let's talk about a bit about who you are for some context so that we can get into how we even met. Because we met over mutual conversations we were having on social media.
I've been working on consciousness and personal development and transformation really since I was around 15, and I'm almost 65. So that's almost 50 years. And I have a long history of everything from studying philosophy and being in a neo-pagan in the Church of All Worlds for 10 years. I really do believe in Gaia, or the goddess. That's mainly my religion, although I'm also Jewish and participate in that. And at a certain point in the mid to late 1990s, I founded something called enlightenment.com, where I got to interview people like Ken Wilber. He gave me his first ever audio interview. Byron Katie, Dan Millman, all the people who I wanted to talk to, I was able to interview them. And throughout that time, I kept a lot of different things. And substances and working with plant medicines goes back also all the way to college. And I had a couple of magnificent teachers, a guy named William Carl Eichmann, who was a cross between Gurdjieff and Crowley. And then around 1990, after I moved to California and after I went to law school, I only practiced law for 1 year. I then became a ghostwriter and editor, mainly for the financial services industry, although I fired them and I'm doing much more interesting things. At a certain point, I met Jim Fadiman in about 1990 at a psychedelic conference. I asked him if he would be my mentor, and he said, "Who are you?" And we developed a close personal relationship. And then he was advising me on enlightenment.com. And then in 2006 or 8, we wrote a review together on the Spirit Molecule book about DMT. And then I helped Jim a little bit with his 2011 book, The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. There's a couple of things in there that are mine, like the checklist. And there's a report on someone who had been doing microdosing, which is actually from me. And so I learned about microdosing shortly after Jim Fadiman did in around 2009 or 10, and then was following his protocol very strictly in terms of how much time to take off and how many days to take off. I really believed in it, and we kept up with that. And then in 2015, Jim Fadiman and I wrote a book together called Your Symphony of Selves, which is all about healthy multiplicity, the idea that everybody has different parts or selves or subpersonalities. If you take that seriously, your life gets a lot better and easier, and so does everyone else's. Some of your readers might know about IFS, or internal family systems. What we've written is similar, but it is much more comprehensive. It's both simpler and more radical. We start at a different place, which is the idea that there's an assumption that you're a single self, and that's not right. And so when you get rid of that, you have a whole different approach. So when we were done with the book in 2020, it was time we realized that Jim needed to really write his microdosing book. Jim Fadiman, as the early developer of modern microdosing, really wrote the book about microdosing, but now it was time to actually write a book about microdosing. And that took us, we started in 2020. After a year, we got turned down by some people, and then we had a new agent, and he said, this is great, but you need to completely rewrite your 100-page proposal. Let's do it in a question and answer format, like what to expect when you're expecting. And that got the attention of 8 major publishers and editors. And we've been at it ever since. So my friendship with Jim goes back to 1990 and has only gotten stronger personally. And now we're full on writing partners after 10 years of doing this with each other. And then when the pandemic started, I was not in a good space. And I came on Clubhouse just a few weeks after January 7th. And I really liked it and fell into several different communities, the Integral community and the Psychedelics community and a couple of other places. And we were able to meet there and become friends there. And we've stayed friends since.
Mm-hmm. I love it. And this is like, well, first, I guess before I go into, I'll pick up from there. Your Symphony of Selves to me made perfect sense because I have joked my entire life that I am the collective, that there is not one of me in here. I've just learned that there needed to be a reorganization of like the C-suite executives of my internal system because the
Right.
16-year-old was the one making executive decisions on things they had no experience and they were reactive and hurt and those things. So we actually, in our coaching program, it's one of our suggested readings. Like we don't require it, but we're like, we highly suggest it because even in the psychedelic space, this idea of like the ego is this like unified self thing is it doesn't even make any sense when you start to think about things in such a singular
Yeah.
fashion.
When you know that people have different selves and they or you are on a psychedelic, it becomes a lot easier to deal with people. Or even in regular life. Last week,
Mhm.
something happened that completely triggered the 3-year-old part of me. I was sitting here crying my eyes out for 2 minutes. And then I thought, you know what? I need to turn this around. It's not as big a deal as I thought. And I work with that part of me. I did a little bit of breath work, the 2 deep inhales through the nose and letting out through the mouth. And in Clubhouse terms, I took that self off the stage and went back to the audience. And then I went to the park and I did rain magic, which seems to have worked. And a lot of good things happened. But it was only because I know that part of me was really upset. And you have to let that part really feel its feelings completely. And then you have to find out what it needs or what it wants. What's a mistake is to try to get rid of or banish or kill one of your parts. That never works. Carl Jung himself used the analogy of a ball that you try to hold under a pool. It's gonna pop back up. It's just a matter of time. So we find if you're facilitating someone on a high dose trip, it's very useful to know that they have wounded parts or selves that may come out in full force and to remind them that's not all of who they are and to know how to work with that part. So in the long run, we think it might be the more important of the 2 books that we've written together, but it's actually a lot harder to get somebody to take seriously the idea that they have multiple selves that are real, that have their own entelechy or life purpose, that don't always agree with each other, and that you have to learn to them because modern psychiatry, modern religion, lots of stuff says that's crazy. And if you hear voices, you're crazy and all that stuff. But we think it's absolutely vital and important to know that they are real. And once you do, everything works a lot better in life.
Well, and like you said, especially right now, the conversation around microdosing is very mainstream. But because it has that little bit of added intrigue, people are more willing to have the conversation. And there's something about just being able to understand that you do have parts that to me, I actually, like I said, it totally resonated for me personally. But to me, the 2 books going hand in hand, because if you understand on a microdosing protocol, you start doing parts work on yourself or understanding and getting to know them. What age is coming forward? Where did you first see that or experience that or whatever? The 2 in tandem is a big part of how I teach body language, like how to start understanding the senses and the feelings, like the actual sensations that come, because they usually come with parts and ages, or a certain body part hurts. And that is often associated with certain woundings I had as a child or a chronic pain that happened from an accident, but it wasn't the accident that the pain is still expressing. It's the emotion of the
Right.
accident or what was happening in the environment.
And if you have trauma locked in your body, there's a lot of talk about trauma informed practitioners, and that trauma is going to be associated with a part of you that's a certain age, and it might not even be the same sex that you normally are. And just knowing this, they really do go hand in hand. We were very careful in each book not to bring in the other book But
Hmm.
now I believe we're going to more consciously meld them. And if we do a follow-on book of essays, which I think might be in the works, then selves and psychedelics is it's obvious. I mean, when I am microdosing, I'm both more aware of which self I'm in, and I'm more easily able to move between myself. We like to say that mental health is being in the right mind at the right time. So once you know that you have selves and that they're real and that they don't always agree with each other and you can't get rid of them, you learn to love them up into the whole, as one of our contributors said.
Yes, the I watch people. So I've been in the psychedelic field as far from a therapeutic perspective for this will be my 16th year. And the amount of times for myself as well, but in the amount of times I've watched people continue to go back because they're trying to heal this unification as if then they'll never have pain or sadness or anything again. But the what I keep seeing is it's like they just keep digging. They just keep digging because then they go out in the real world and get sad again and think something's wrong with them. Like I didn't heal right. If I would have healed right in that psychedelic ceremony, then I wouldn't have this come up again. Versus when you can take this idea of the multiplicity, the different selves and personalities and how they show up, then when you go into ceremonies, you recognize, oh, I might be working with a wounding this time as a 3-year-old. Next time I might be doing it as going to actually be with my 3-year-old as my current version of myself. Same
Hmm.
environment, but completely different narrative, different approach, different feeling. And that just to be able to know that difference gives so much freedom to not have to keep digging. It's like just bringing the awareness in and then live your life. So I'd
Yeah,
love to kind of transition from here, Jordan, because you have
sure.
this new book coming out with microdosing. And I think that it's a conversation we haven't broached like exactly on this
Hmm.
podcast, like we've talked about it. So this is Psychedelic Coach, but we really talk about coaching yourself, coaching other people in the modality of psychedelics, entheogens, all of that. So what got you into microdosing personally? Was it you mentioned having gym, but did you ever have experiences that didn't go well for you, or has it been honky dory since you started the process?
Yeah, microdosing has worked pretty well for me all along. I think that there is the tendency to fall for the mores, as our friend Avi Esther puts it. And you figure that, well, if I'm right here at 8 or 9 micrograms and it's great, then 12 or 15 will be better. And that's absolutely not true. In microdosing, less is more. So what I keep learning in my process is both that I need to schedule time off after several weeks on. I need to take a couple of weeks off to get back to ground zero and recalibrate. And certainly I don't ever microdose 2 days in a row. Well, except maybe if I'm on vacation, maybe that might happen. And it's just, I mean, mostly I've used it for more on the performance side, and this is jumping ahead a bit. But the way we're seeing it, microdosing has two or possibly three main categories of benefits. One of those categories of benefits is physical and mental health conditions. In the book, we go through an A to Z list from anorexia to zoster or shingles, and actually talk about 40 conditions, including depression, including ADHD, and that's not what I've been using it for. I mean, I do have some intermittent depression and childhood issues. I'm not enlightened completely, but I'm enlightened enough to go on. And when you were saying before, I used to be one of those people who fervently believed in the big bang of enlightenment, or it was like some orgasm that went on forever. And I sought for that and I looked for that. And on Clubhouse, I met a guy named Heron Stone, whose motto is, I'm enlightened enough. And I'm just going with, I'm enlightened enough. So I don't know that I'm going to have new levels of huge spiritual breakthroughs. I'm usually not courting major doses anymore unless I'm with my men's group, or occasionally medium doses. I'm not looking for a huge level of insight that will change me forever, but I am looking to live, a better life in other ways. So we have the physical and mental health conditions as one category. And the second category is enhanced wellness, flow, and performance. So for me, for example, I found out that when I'm microdosing, it's really great for working out. There's more energy, I'm sharper, I get more done. And I've used it off and on for that for quite a while. And I really like that. And
There
also sometimes,
was a recent golf magazine, one of the
oh,
big
yeah, oh,
Forbes or something, did a big article on golfing.
well, so in the book, we cover a bunch of different sports. And in the very end of the book, which we'll get to, Jim and I both make predictions, which we know is a fool's game. But one of my predictions is that in every single sport and every type of creative and physical endeavor, you're going to have people who are competitive and interested in being as best as they can, who are going to work with microdosing. So we talk about running, we talk about volleyball, we talk about mixed martial arts, but I'm sure it's going to work the same way in nearly almost anything you can name, which sort of gets to a problem that I'll just bring up now. When we put the book out, we were looking at what David Nutt, who's a professor in England, he's very well respected, and he has this comment that he was thinking microdosing was pretty good, but then he was seeing that people were saying it's good for 15 different things. And then he said, it's just got to be too good to be true. And so people tend to have, now we have 35 or 40 conditions, right? Not we're saying they work for all of them for everyone, but we have interesting things to report, and people who are experiencing these things would want to know. I'm losing my track a little bit.
We're saying the medical conditions, all the different fields.
Medical conditions, the physical conditions, enhanced performance, wellness, and flow. You can think of the third type of benefit as enhanced communication within yourself, intrahuman, your symphony of selves, and both with the people in your life. People are more patient, they wait longer, they listen better, they're having better sex, primarily because they're feeling emotionally closer. Mm-hmm. So you see this really wide range of benefits. And you ask, why is this so? And while you'll often hear on podcasts, microdosing isn't a magic pill and you need to have intentional, it's like, in some ways it is like a magic vitamin pill. And we know because it works on neuroplasticity. We're certain at this point that microdosing produces similar types of neuroplasticity as macrodosing does, the same signal, but at a lower amplitude. And that's for brain flow. That's for when you light up the brain, you're using different kind of EEGs and all of that stuff. And also for markers like BDNF. We know that microdosing produces additional neuroplasticity. We also know that psychedelics, including LSD and psilocybin and amanita, which is being used more, are all anti-inflammatory. They're all strong anti-inflammatories. So people have less inflammation and they feel better. We also know that microdosing returns people to a sense of equilibrium. So whether it's somebody saying, wow, I'm back after years of feeling depressed and taking SSRIs was just to lower their affect, but don't help at all, they're back. And if it's a physical thing, they'll start making better choices, like not drinking so much alcohol, or maybe any, or maybe less pot, or better food. So we have all of these things going on at the same time. It's the neuroplasticity, it's the anti-inflammatory effect, it's the bringing us to equilibrium, it's better attention and awareness of different selves. So when you put all of that together, it's not that hard to see really why there are many health conditions that might make a difference too. And there are we're going to find out that virtually every creative and physical endeavor is going to have microdosing aficionados, simply because it works, and people are going to be taking time off their running, and they're going to be doing better yoga, and they're going to be writing better and making better music and singing better. So again, we're afraid of, it's just too good to be true, but this is what we're hearing from people.
Well, and even too good to be true, we don't have much competition as far as comparison with SSRIs and other medications. There's just much higher effectiveness in so many different ways without a lot of the symptoms and issues that come with side effects of medications people are taking. And it's something that we've seen, especially with the Condor approach, and especially with our coaching container, where we're working more with facilitators, people that are microdosing coaches. It's not that it's even from what we're seeing. So this is totally my perspective, folks. This is not medical advice or anything, but from what we've seen is we saw that health runs on a continuum from ease to dis-ease. So what you do or don't do moves that dial along that continuum. So if someone is microdosing and they've been really stressed out at work and just all the thoughts spinning in their head, but it can slow them down enough to go for a walk today instead of hit another cup of coffee and go sit in front of their desk, even just to start their morning. They come back home a little more relaxed, have 10 minutes to connect to their spouse before they get into their day. They just down-regulated. They just got more ease in their body. So it's almost like the microdose gave them the breath, that moment of pause before going into the habits they're used to. Then with that heightened neuroplastic state, if they can have a little activity when they're microdosing that supports creating a little more space and do different than they've done, We're seeing it, like you said, microdosing coaches that are working with executives, that are working with chronically ill folks, with alcoholics, with whatever, where they're just helping to create the bumpers for the bowling alley so someone doesn't end up in the gutter. What are we measuring? And do they have a little bit of a structure so that people don't start just doing the more is more? Like you said, and not just in microdosing, but in macrodosing and full dosing, people do that too. If one ceremony in the jungle is good, then maybe 10 over a week will be 10 times better. So it's like those
Maybe.
mentalities, I see less than more as far as like you're saying that can be long-term effective. So who would microdosing maybe not be for? Or where would maybe caution be?
Well, first of all, if anybody has any compunction or any issues with psychedelics and isn't interested, we're never telling anyone that they should try this.
Oh,
What we've done is present a buffet of possibilities and are reporting mainly from participatory citizen scientists, but also as much real science as we could find in the world. So if you have any question at all, we have a section called the value of hesitation. If Jim has long said that if someone comes up to him and says, I want to try a psychedelics, but Jim just stops him and says, doesn't matter what the but is. If you have any but at all, it's not a good thing. So then you come to questions about certain classes of people who are traditionally thought to it's not okay for them to take any sort of psychedelic. And this would be people with schizophrenia or schizophrenia in their family and bipolar in their family. And we're a little softer on that. We actually haven't seen any cases of somebody taking a verified microdose and having a full-blown schizophrenic episode or bipolar. That doesn't seem to actually happen. Everybody has to be incredibly cautious because of possible legal ramifications. But when you look for real data about people who have had bad times just because they microdosed, you won't find any. The same thing is true as people are talking about heart valves. There might be heart valve thickening. That's a pharmacological model that they have absolutely no real world evidence for. And in fact, a paper just came out that they asked Jim to review. He may or may not. And they started out by saying, well, it's a theoretical model and we have no, I can't say that word.
I know what word you're
Epidemiological evidence.
that.
And then they say, and when we first ran our numbers, we actually saw that people who microdosed had less heart valve problems. But then we reran our numbers and now we still think there's an association. So there this pharmacological model and people have a Jones for it to try to prove that there must be something wrong. And in fact, those were based on tests that they did with, I think, rats at high doses of a similar but different drug. So it's all very different, but they're looking for something that's wrong. A similar case is the idea of pregnant, breastfeeding, and early parenting moms. If you look for research on that, there is no research anywhere. The US government says there's no research. If you go to the Microdosing Institute, they've got a great website where they talk about indigenous people of different types who we know their mothers and children were using it, but then they go, but because we have no research, we absolutely say no one should try this. Well, Michaela de la Maico and Naomi Tolson and now Wendy have come along and they're going, hey, we have this research with 400 moms, 10 pages of which we published in the book. And while there is some stomach upset and fear of illegality and maybe some sleep stuff, by and large, when you read these 10 pages of reports on these moms, it is so overwhelmingly positive and amazing, from less postpartum depression to better latching mechanics with their child to being able to parent multiple. Like when you read this, if you were a young mother, you go, well, of course, I'm going to do that. But it's so completely forbidden. It's a third rail that no one can suggest it, and you'll never get real funding for a university study because it's assumed that it must be really terrible for pregnant women and their babies. But we have absolutely no proof of that. And actually, the anecdotal evidence, as we're calling it, or the participatory citizen science evidence, is pretty strong that these moms were wowed by it.
It goes back to, I just got full body chills because like you said, going down to the Amazon, different tribal cultures that I've been in and worked with, it's a part of the culture. So it's not like they're giving full cups of ayahuasca to a child or the mother's not drinking the whole time, but like they have a yearly gathering of all the tribes, at least down in Brazil. And so they all drink during that whole time. How much they drink might vary, and the hape, and it's a part of the lifestyle. And so it's important for people to know, like at the end of the day, you have to approach it being the scientist of yourself. Again, not to condone anything, but if for those like I have found for myself, there are certain medical things that I was able to work with that I was not getting any results with medical, that I was getting test after test and doctors finally saying, "Oh, we don't know, it's fibromyalgia, I guess." But what it was internalized shame. It was inflammation. No one told me to change my diet and exercise. And even after I did all, there was like 60% of my symptoms. The other 40% was self-hate and trauma. And if there was no way a doctor was going to be able to get to that last 40%, but by
Mhm.
28, I couldn't even walk for 3 hours at Disneyland because the swelling in my knees got so bad. So I was
Mm.
desperate to find another way because I came from the once an addict, always an addict world. I would never have thought I'd come back to this side. Spoke at Montel Williams, the DARE program, got a day of recognition from the state of Utah for my efforts in educating on the dangers of drugs. And so I had to get to a desperation level that I was open to the possibility that, especially with fungi, the potential that could be there that was outside of what I experienced in the rave scene or the club scene. So I'm sure you've had a lot of people come to you and be like, Jordan, I don't know. I had mushrooms in college and they're locked into that previous experience. So what has that
Well,
been for you?
yeah, there certainly are people. I think a really important point that a couple of people, including Patrick, our friend, has been making is that it may be that the full doses that people have always taken, keep in mind a microdose is about 1/10 to 1/20th of a full recreational dose. So if a full recreational dose is 100 micrograms of LSD, a microdose is going to be 5 to 10 micrograms, but we say 7 to 12, more or less. Same thing with if a full dose of, and mushrooms are trickier because there's a lot more variables. Let's say a full dose of an ordinary cultivar is 3 grams. So microdosing is going to be as 50 to 300 milligrams at most. So we're seeing that it may be that the stronger doses that people have always taken, where they sometimes have crazy visuals. I mean, we know what it's like on a high psychedelic trip, but you could see that as being a kind of overdose. And that the true kind of functional, the broad swath of physical and mental help that conditions that microdosing gives and the performance is all with people taking these small doses. We don't say subperceptual anymore, but we say sub-threshold. That's really the big, broad swath of benefits that most people are going to get. That's the real dose. And that most full-on psychedelic trips are a kind of an overdose. But in any case, they're completely different substances and completely different
Totally.
experiences. There's many volumes written about high-dose trips. And all of the stuff they talk about there with giant anacondas eating you and the world changes, and I've seen the Greek gods in the sky and all of that stuff. You don't have any of that. As Isla Waldman put it in her book, very often you just have a really good day and you even forget that you are microdosing if you keep the dose small enough. It's more like being on coffee and you're aware that you're on something, but it doesn't become the key factor of what you're doing. You don't have any qualms about having your ordinary day. Nobody knows that you're on anything different other than you might be a little nicer and more relaxed than normal. And there's no substantial changes of consciousness. There's no visuals. There's no mental changes. You're not having anything like that. So when people stick to that level, it's hard though sometimes when people have trip because have full psychedelic trips because they keep expecting that this
Mhm.
is what they're going to get. So it's not like there's a tiny little trip. In fact, there's a really funny cartoon that we couldn't get the rights for the book, but it says Greg microdoses and sees God's elbow. And there's like this picture of the classic God figure in the clouds, and just his elbow is sticking through the clouds. And it's like, it's not like that. Although with some substances, I think it is like that. We had to draw some lines about what's in the recommended, what people say they're microdosing, but we're not so sure, and what's out. And so one of the things that's out for us is DMT.
Mhm.
And the reason is I was at a friend's, she was almost dying, and I was there with our very good friend, and her son exhaled on a DMT vape pen from like 5 feet away from me. And enough of that got into me through my nostrils to have all of my DMT stuff. Like I knew what that was, and part of my body was ready to go. And it was like my foot or my toe actually was already in a full psychedelic state. So some substances good, some substances not so good, even though people talk about them. Another one that people talk about microdosing is cannabis, marijuana. And we're going, no, not really. First of all, people never microdose it the way they microdose other substances. They don't have a teeny tiny little bit and don't have more. I mean, almost nobody does that. And the neuroplasticity response is different. And if anything, most cannabis, especially the modern stuff that's all high THC and nothing else, it's negative on neuroplasticity and learning. And that's why they're warning younger kids away from it. So as much as I love cannabis, you don't really microdose cannabis. It's a different sort of thing.
Yeah, and like you said, there's even with ayahuasca, iboga, some other things where people are saying microdosing. I think there's one thing to have an essence in a tincture where you want to connect to the spirit of, say, like the trichruna vine, which is what is in ayahuasca. But people are approaching microdosing as I'll just take less. But like you said, there's some things that and this is my own personal opinion, but it's like if you're going to work with ayahuasca, then go work with the culture or the tribe or go have the experience versus a microdose of it. Where I feel like mushrooms are a very different intelligence that whether it's micro or more, when you're doing those more expansive doses, it's just asking yourself why. Like, what are you looking for? What are you trying to do? They are just categorically different. Like there are
Well,
certainly things in higher doses I couldn't have accessed in microdose, but they're just such different experiences.
I will say, though, that as far as ayahuasca goes, there's an organization in Peru called Microhuasca, and they have developed a protocol for microdosing with just the vine, the Banisterius
Mhm.
yapi vine, and that seems to work pretty well.
That's
It
what I'm
doesn't
listening
have,
to.
it's not illegal because it doesn't have the DMT component, so you can buy it, and it is some type of a serotonin uptake inhibitor. So that's where we're thinking it comes from. So that seems to work pretty well for those who like that, as does Amanita, which always surprises me. I was surprised we put Amanita in a book, but Jim had written a foreword for a previous book on microdosing with Amanita. But the funny thing about Amanita is that it works on a completely different pathway in the brain than all the serotonergic substances. It works on the GABA patent pathway. So how is it? But if you look into it, there are two different ways that we know that Amanita can either excite or inhibit neurotransmissions. And it also is a strong anti-inflammatory, and it does bring people back to equilibrium. And it does seem to have anxiety squarely in its wheelhouse, and it is legal. So there's a lot of things going for ayahuasca. The thing about, Amanita, the thing that's
Yeah.
against it is that if you take a high enough dose and you haven't properly decarboxylated it, you could really mess yourself up. You're unlikely to die, but it can get very bad. And people do go to the hospital all the time picking them and eating it. So you have to have an understanding that it has to be decarboxylated or properly prepared. And I've never even actually taken a high dose of Amanita decarboxylated. I'm not interested in what Amanita can do in terms of rewriting my hard drive in the brain. I mean, we have friends who love it and it's way out there and very different, but it doesn't appeal to me. But as a microdosing agent, Amanita muscaria and even Amanita pantherina are really good, solid substances that'll do what you need as well. So there's a lot of options out there, and there's going to be more as people grow more and more of their own mushrooms. And we'll see what happens in the legal situation. Jim likes to make the analogy that microdosing is a little bit like Frodo. It's a little bit like a hobbit. It's small. People don't pay a lot of attention to it. So it's able to get in places and do things with people without a whole big uproar. And of course, the other advantages of microdosing compared to macrodosing is it's a lot safer. You're not going to have anybody that we know of having an intense bad trip. It's a lot easier to do in terms of you can do it at home. You don't even really need a guide at all. And less expensive. It's easier to work with if you're microdosing. But the belief is that if you're doing a microdosing protocol, that the neuroplasticity and the other advantages build over time. So at this low dose, especially if you're on the Fadiman protocol, or at least, which is 1 day on and 2 days off, or at least no more than every other day, you have time to experience and integrate the learning that you're going. Andrew Huberman talks about neuroplasticity being like a boulder that gets moved out of place in your mind by the big lever of a big psychedelic. Well, with microdoses, you're still having the same thing, but it's a much smaller lever and it's a much smaller rock. But when you unleash it, it still starts rolling through the village of your mind. And you should be aware that you have the opportunity to create new neural connections. You have the opportunity to let go of things that don't work for you. Neuroplasticity is very interesting, and we don't really understand very much yet at all about the brain or how psychedelics work. Or last summer, before I wrote our section on neuroplasticity, I was doing some heavy science reading, and I learned that there are seven different ways, seven, that neurons talk to each other. It's not just the charged particle at the axon of the dendrite that we've talked about. They communicate by radio waves. They put these little tiny packets that go through the membrane and travel on the 7 different ways. And we're not even at the beginning of figuring out how all of this works.
Yeah, I had Sean Wells on the show just a couple weeks ago, and that's what he was talking about too, is we used to think it was just degenerate over time. Your brain health would just deteriorate and the neurons would just deteriorate and the brain cells would just deteriorate with age. And now we're finding that's just not true, that you can regenerate, right? And I think that especially when it comes to microdosing, like to your point, I've watched people go to 70 ayahuasca ceremonies, but they don't come back and change the daily practices that microdosing really encourages, that kind of daily habit and check in, whether it's if you're doing a day on, day off, but if you're doing any sort of journaling, any other just other practices with your body and presence, I find a lot more people get better results over a longer period of time by having those more micro shifts, those little awarenesses in the day,
Well,
that pause before they react.
it's more realistic also when you're taking a big psychedelic and think it's going to enlighten you. I remember I first took MDMA and it was called Adam back then. It was about 1984. And the woman that I was with promised me that I would have full enlightenment and aware, and nothing like that happened. And I was really disappointed. So I think there's something about when you take a big dose, it's like almost like a Hail Mary and like huge changes are going to happen or not. If you're taking a microdose, you have a lot more of an opportunity to explore what I'm going to call the placebo process. Placebo isn't just a statistical artifact that messes up experiments. It refers to the way that our minds and bodies are interacting and constantly co-creating reality, and whether that's how your genes are expressing or what hormones are coming out or your food choices. And with microdosing, because it's slowed down enough, people very often can be more sensible. And if they have a positive program that they're setting out intentions and journaling, and if that's what they believe they need to do for it to work, then it will work better. Other people don't want to be bothered. They really just want to take the magic pill and get better. And that works also. But when you have the big doses, it's like then you're tired for days. You might have to skip work. You can't talk to people. I mean, it takes time to recover from a big dose. It doesn't take any time to recover from a microdose. It's all about having your ordinary day and your ordinary life. And as we were talking about being able to move in and out of the different parts of who you are and go, oh, I'm in my interviewing self. That's different than I'm with my daughter, which is different than I'm with my daughter and her friends. And that's different than if I'm with some of my clients. All of these are really different parts. And so you just see more easily because it's slowed down. It's a lot easier to integrate and see what's going on and make good use of it and take advantage of what you're experiencing.
Hmm. Yeah, it really comes down to it's a personality thing, right? It's like knowing yourself. Like for me, I really don't need guidance, or I would say I don't need a lot of accountability. If I decide to do something, like I've got it, I know me, whatever. If there's something new I'm navigating, then I put myself in communities and conversation I can have for more resource. So as you've been going through this book and talking to more people, what is a question you wish more people would ask, or more you wish more people knew about microdosing that maybe they don't usually ask, or you would just like people to know?
Well, I just thought of the whole idea about the stigma against psychedelics and why there's such broad stigma because people are anti-pleasure, they're anti-changing what we've done with the body that God didn't give us, as it were. There's a lot of reluctance, and so I guess this is a very good question, but I'd like to know if people are really willing to give psychedelics another chance in this whole different way. Like I went on and watched an old Dragnet where Joe Friday is interviewing this very Timothy Leary-like character, and they have actually a really spirited argument about cogs in the machine and new levels of consciousness. And Friday, of course, is just kids are jumping off the roof and frying the brain. And I don't think it's like that. So because we're not promoting and we're not selling anything other than the book, I mean, Jim actually resigned from a bunch of commercial indications. I would like to know why people wouldn't want to try it. Because if you're going to be more creative or you're going to feel better or you're going to have better sex or you're going to possibly heal something that's been bothering you for a long time compared to any of the ways we have to do this with modern pharmacological medicine is usually so heavy-handed. Like think about 3-year-olds who are being prescribed Adderall. There's hundreds of thousands of them because that's the government says they're good to go at age 3. We're
Mhm.
going, Oh, so first you gotta, microdosing is very helpful for helping people taper off substances. You can't just quit a pharmaceutical. We all know that. But why wouldn't we try some of these things like for ADHD and for autism and for, well, why not try it? Or something like, there's some we have really good evidence for, like headaches, both cluster headaches and migraines. Does microdosing get rid of migraines? No, but people have less and they're less intense. Same thing with cluster headaches. Cluster Busters is a great organization. When they first started, members of the board were taking 5 and in one case 7 grams because that was the only way in the world they knew how to disrupt their quote unquote suicide headaches. And cluster headaches are supposed to be maybe the worst pain a human being can have. Now they recommend having people start at 0.25, a quarter of a gram, 250 milligrams, and try that out. So you start low and you go slow. And so there's a lot of different things that, we have at least some evidence that microdosing might work for. And then, of course, we get to the question of, yeah, but isn't it all anecdotal? And you don't have that many real RCTs, double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized trials. And we spend a lot of time in the book on that. We talk about how in the West, since the Royal Academy was founded in the 1660s, people have been talking about drugs and discussing among themselves different substances as a way of gathering information and figuring out what works. Ken Wilber uses the fancy term intersubjective hermeneutical verification. And what that basically means is you have a community of the qualified. If a bunch of Zen masters are sitting in a panel and someone comes in and they talk to them for 3 minutes, they will all know and agree about how far along that person is on this path of Zen. Same thing with Aikido or dance or many things. So people know this is actually working in a wide variety of indications, but you would be surprised. Yesterday, I ran into a real hater. I'm contacting many of the psychedelic societies and organizations in the world to let them know about the book. And I ran into this person who was like, it's just the homeopathy of microdosing. You have no proof. You don't have any real stories. And I'm like, and I just actually stopped communicating with this person because they told me they weren't.
It's futile. Yeah.
There's nothing I can do to change their mind. And so we do sometimes find high dose people who don't like microdosing. Sometimes it's because they have economic or academic interests in high doses is the only thing that's of importance. So when you look at microdosing, it might ultimately be very disruptive in a wide range of industries and in the health industry, mental wellness. And we're back to the sports and the physical stuff as well. So we're just excited in all the places it seems to be going. And generally speaking, how incredibly safe it is, how low risk it is. If it doesn't work, if you don't feel anything, or you're one of the very rare people that has a bad result somehow, maybe you had some gastric distress, then you just stop. You don't have to work with someone to stop. It doesn't take days. You just stop. And we have noticed that some people do want to, even if they're doing microdosing, they want a lemon tech. They want to put lemon juice over it for 20 to 30 minutes because that pre-digests the psilocybin and it begins to become psilocin, and it's a lot easier for people to deal with.
Yeah. No, I mean, what you're saying, I'm always reluctant to listen to anyone that is very rigid in whether it's high dose or I have shifted people that said high dose, like Baba Kalindi high dose, that people are 25 grams plus saying microdose is bullshit. And now they've changed their mind. But I've had people microdose shift too, where I'm like, if we just take a bio-individual approach and say, what is the intention of the person? Because I support a lot of people. I've worked professional, like as full-time as a facilitator in retreats. I've worked full-time as a coach, and I've worked full-time as a coach with no substances, just helping a person identify the tools and the strategies that improve or support or impact their life. And so for me, it's like for the listener, anyone that tells you this is the only way, leave, because it's limited, it's not grounded on anything, and that might have been their experience, but only because they weren't open to seeing anything else. I've seen incredible results both directions.
I mean, that's the thing, because so many people, including people who are older and have experience with or know about high doses, only think of it that way. This idea that it's a totally different substance at this dose with a totally different range of effects that seem to be really beneficial in all sorts of ways. I mean, keep in mind that when James Fadiman first heard about microdosing in 2009 from Bob Fort, who had heard that Albert Hofmann had been taking low doses, which were probably more like 50, and then walking in the woods, and then Jim misheard or somehow came up with, let's try even way lower. At that point, Jim had absolutely no interest in microdoses when he first heard, and neither did anybody he knew. He was interested in transcendental doses, or at least the doses that they did with the scientists, which were more like in the 80 microgram range, I believe, to get them to come out with a creative business and science breakthroughs. No one at all was interested in really tiny doses. So what's interesting is that you don't normally have a situation like this where there's a whole brand new thing. So we like to say that, and there's a line in the beginning of the book that I just want to read, that in the crap, I should have this ready. Sorry.
No, you're fine. I edit, so you're fine.
It's in the, where did it go? It's in the disclaimers. Where are my disclaimers? I know they're here somewhere in the beginning of the book. Here it is. Indigenous acknowledgement. This book was conceived, written, and edited primarily on Ohlone land. We recognize that many traditional native and indigenous peoples have used plant medicines, including psychedelics, sometimes in ways that resemble modern microdosing. We intend to acknowledge and appreciate rather than unconsciously or wrongfully appropriate their contributions. So while there have been people taking microdoses for thousands of years, and the Microdosing Institute's webpage has a good history of it, modern microdosing, where you're taking this very specifically limited range and you're on a protocol or a schedule where there's different protocols. Paul Stamets has a protocol where you're on for 5 days and off for 2, or on for 4 and off for 3. We very much like beginners starting with Jim's protocol because it's the most conservative. So it's a refrain on less is more, and start low and go slow. But at this range, it's just such a different thing, and people are getting such value. So it's hard to tell where we are in the trajectory of microdosing, if it's a curve like this, or if it's gone up like this and we're going to go down. We think that if people really begin to realize all of the amazing things that it actually can do, and that we have many reports on, that it's just going to go and really take off. So when Jim started asking people if they would try some microdosing and report back to him, and then reporters started contacting him, and he mentioned it in a chapter in the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. This went all the way up to interviews with Ayla Waldman and Michael Pollan. And even on the cover of the book, right on the top, microdosing seemed to be going on all around me. Not surprisingly, all roads led back to Jim Fadiman. So Jim created this, and I think of it like in Dune. You know how they have the thumper in the sand, and it's a steady beat, and it draws the sandworms? Jim started putting out a steady beat about what microdosing might be capable of before we knew about almost any of the physical conditions or almost any of the enhanced performance other than coding, and gaining information. And it became a positive feedback loop, or a virtuous circle, or just a snowball. And to us, it looks like it's still building. So you do have people who say it's just a placebo, which some great research by Connor Murray definitively shows it's not. And on this woman who was the hater that I found, she was like, I believe that microdosing is just a homeopathy of psychedelics. So I immediately responded to her and said, well, listen, that's not a good analogy, because at the higher doses of homeopathy, you have statistically less than 1 molecule of the original substance in the preparation. With microdosing, each microgram of LSD has 1.54 quadrillion molecules of LSD in it. The average microdose has about, let's say it's 10, has about 15 quadrillion molecules in it. Your body has maybe 30, 40 trillion cells, and maybe 1 out of 10, although I've made these numbers up, I've researched, but nobody's given me a definitive answer, is potentially affectable by LSD. So if you have 4 trillion cells that can be affected, and you're taking in 15 quadrillion, that's so many molecules to go around and cause these impacts. And again, we have blood flow, we have brain scans, we have BDNF, we have all sorts of indications that microdosing is very similar to macrodosing, almost the same signal, but at a much lower amplitude. So we know that something is really going on, and we also know that the best zone is at this really low level. So Doc Ellis threw a no-hitter on LSD on a high dose. There's a fantastic video of it, like in squiggle vision. And he was just so incredibly high, it's surprising that he was even able to stand up on the mound and throw it. But for most people, most of the time, let's say you're into writing music. If you take 25 micrograms instead of 10, you're going to be at a dose where you're not going to be interested in doing music, or a different self might show up that it's not the same thing. So there's this really wonderful area. It's like electrons. They're at different orbital shells. They're here or they're here. They're not in between. If we're down here with microdosing, where we know it works really well, it works really well in a lot of things. And that's why we're so excited and feel like we're really only at the beginning of finding out where this is going to go.
There was the first time that I experienced a microdose, really, I had been making chocolates for a retreat that I was doing, so ceremonial cacao with psilocybin. And the very end of the spoon, so I had already scraped everything off. It's just the film. So we're talking about a micro, right? And
Right.
so I just sucked off the rest of the spoon because it was just the film, but there's no powder, no dust. Like that had already been mixed in the bowl, all that. And all of a sudden, and it's like 8 p.m. and I'm sitting there, and all of a sudden, I just yawned, and I didn't think anything of it. But nothing's changing, no other sub perceptual or no other perceptual changes in my anything. But then I yawned again, and I know that with mushrooms, my body down regulates. So I was like,
Mhm.
no way. Suddenly, not suddenly, but then my to do list just vanished. It wasn't important anymore. So I went and sat down with my instruments and I just started to sing because it was just like it, that's just what felt correct in that moment. I'd been trying to increase my range and there was two breaks in my voice and I got a full 4 octave range that night and
Wow.
I learned that I did not need training to sing anymore. I needed to relax and connect to sing
Hmm.
more.
Right.
And that's not
Right.
something I could have, and not that I haven't had beautiful experiences in ceremonies or with like the Huni Queen and singing, but this was like I didn't feel any different. This would have been a micro dose amount, but it's not something that I really understood how powerful that little bit was until it was just tapped in, just clicked in to who I am a little bit more, where not that the other stuff didn't matter. The to-do list will be there in a little while. It's fine. But I was
Mhm.
so just tapped into myself when I started to sing. I got through that four range or through the full range, which is 4 octaves. And now I also got to teach my body what that feels like to be tapped in to my creativity, to my voice, to my expression. So it's to me, it's
Well,
I recommend, but can't recommend.
think of it this way. And whether or not you believe in the McKenna Stone ape hypothesis or the crazier idea that the mushrooms have been cultivating us as human beings all along, at the very least, they're a gift from Gaia that is very powerful, that we know somehow seems to work really well with the human being. And sometimes all you need is just this little bit of the gift to be able to unfold a lot of the other magic that's already built into you. I mean, part of the problem is we have 400 years of being flatlanded, of science works so well. It's only things you can measure and see. It's reductionism. That works really well, but we don't tend to believe in our own inner energetic circumstances, or the fact that, well, I'm not going to talk about Trump and dark charisma, but I want to. But we don't tend to believe that magic is real or that we're co creating reality. But if you open up just a little bit and let's say embrace a bit of the Hindu cosmology, where instead of reality being this artifact, but a watch or a machine that was designed and maybe God left or maybe still comes back and messes with it, if instead you think of everything as a big story unfolding, then it's pretty easy to write into that story the fact that the planet that bequeathed us would have ways of helping us out and would be giving us these kind of gifts, and that we can take advantage of them as long as we're not. I mean, there's nothing wrong with high trips and high dose trips. I like them. And as I get older, I'm 64 now, they're less frequent for certain, but they're great. But microdosing it's really working for a lot of people in a lot of different ways that's surprising them. Like the people who have shingles and are seeing improvements, although they're on a slightly different protocol. They take it more often. Or we've pain, chronic pain. Microdosing works really well for chronic pain. And there's just all of this, the whole A to Z list. And you're going, wow, there's something kind of universal about the neuroplasticity and the anti-inflammatory and the return to equilibrium and it being a natural source or an analog of a natural source. And there it is. And we're really very fortunate that this has happened, because if Jim hadn't gone on this path, I don't know that we would be having a worldwide microdosing movement at this point.
Like you said, I believe in the intelligence of mushrooms on the planet now and what they articulate from and the evolution of the planet as part of this consciousness that's required for some would say darker times, that in order to tap into that light, to me, it is the gift of whether we say from God, from the earth, from interdimensional beings, whatever we want to classify is throwing humanity a bone to give us some help. And Look, I'm a big believer in high dose, the same as I am low. It's just what is your intention? And is it a shamanic practice? I've seen so many variations. It's just for anyone listening, you are your own person. You have a different process, you have different intentions and goals. So learn, go read. There's not one path. And honestly, science, you just look at who's paying for it first, because whoever's paying for the
Right.
research, you'll probably find what they're trying to get as far as an outcome.
Oh yeah, I tell you, this new paper on the heart valve thing was hysterical. They weren't a dead or they boxed themselves into a corner 3 times saying, yeah, we don't have anything. And then they reran their numbers with a whole new way of thinking about it and found that there still might be a connection. It's
Right.
like, really? Are you just making this up? Oh, you got funding, you're trying to get more funding. I understand.
Yeah, I'm surrounded with scientists now. You got to meet Sean Wells when we were doing, he came on a lot when we were doing the
I
Clubhouse
remember
stuff.
Sean.
And yeah, and so it's like he's doing a lot of research now too. And he's one of the people that sat and showed me, as far as research, one, how often women are left out of it because if they do have a cycle and how many demographics are not served. Like when you actually look at how science is performed, if you
Right.
don't fit into very certain demographics, you realize that science has nothing to do with you. So we can see it as another tool.
And also on the double blind thing, there's a really great paper that shows that double blinding is done in all of these different ways and it's not consistent. And we like to point out that it was legislated as the gold standard after the thalidomide disaster. Scientists didn't want it, researchers didn't want it, but now it's the one thing. And if you don't satisfy it, your science isn't real. And that's why we quote Jeff Bezos, who says, if your data and your anecdotes disagree, your anecdotes are usually right. And it's not so much that you mismeasured the data, it's that you're just measuring the wrong thing. So the right way to measure the impact of microdosing is the reports we get in, or something like the microdose.me study, where have 8,000 people using an app, including people who actually aren't taking anything. So there is a kind of internal control, and finding what they think on these kind of longitudinal studies with very large ends. And we're getting the same results. So
Yep.
there's a lot of naysayers and a lot of people who don't want to know or hear about this, but there's also a ton of people who understand that for many people, this can be an incredible, especially people who are reluctant or don't want to do a high. I don't like to take a new
Absolutely.
substance that I've never done before just because
I don't do it to try it. I'm not one of those people.
confession, I've never had ketamine because I have issues with dissociation and leaving my body, and used to leave it during school class and had like fight to keep myself in my body. And so I haven't taken it yet. And it's like,
No,
no, I
between
don't
me
need to
and you,
make new drugs.
I'm not a fan for the majority of people, and I'm getting a lot of trauma from ketamine spaces, and it's getting replaced as a replacement for alcohol and numbing.
Right.
And I'm just, yeah, that's another thing for microdosing that doesn't align for me.
Like
But
in
that's a
one of our
story for another.
stories, we have somebody coming in and says, yeah, I bought a 2-year supply of ketamine and used it in a weekend.
Perfect. No, it's to me, yeah, that's a conversation for another day. I have lots of thoughts about that. But so Jordan, where can people get the book? Let's go. Title of the book again. Where can they get the book? And any last words for today?
Sure. So the book is here. You can find it at an easy to remember website, which is microdosingbook.com, which I felt very lucky to stumble onto in April. And you can also find it, of course, on Amazon or through the publisher, which is St. Martin's Press. We're very excited about the audiobook because the book is written in Q&A format. The reader we have is a fellow named Kaleo Griffith, who read one of the Harry Potter books and The Art of the Deal and
Nice.
The Tournament. And so when you hear Kaleo reading, right away you realize, oh, I only have to pay attention to each segment because his voice is so interesting and enthusiastic. So we think we're going to see a lot of the audiobook out there. And of course, it's available as a Kindle as well. But you can find it anywhere. Just look on Microdosing and Fadiman and Gruber, or even just Microdosing book, or the full title, Microdosing for Health, Healing, and Enhanced Performance. There is no subtitle. That's the whole title. And it's, yeah, well, it was a title by committee, but it works pretty well. And it's out there, and we're excited. Podcast after podcast. The book is out on February 18th. Jim and I are going to be at Kepler's bookstore in Menlo Park, which you have to have a ticket for, but to go, and other bookstores in the Bay Area, there's a chance I'm going to be going to the Breaking convention. We'll see what they say. And yeah, it's out there after 4 years, and we're very excited to see what happens on February 18th.
Me too. And y'all, I know I've got a lot of high dosers that listen to this. If you haven't, I mean, if you're still following me, then you have explored microdosing too, because you've learned there's no one route for everyone all the time. This is a really great book. Whether you're new to microdosing or you've never microdosed, or if you have, I think that the way that this is organized, the stories are just long enough and still concise and still a good mixture of facts and studies and things that to me, it's engaging the whole time. At least I'm halfway through it now. I highly recommend it. So I'll put a link in the show notes so you guys could check it out.
And we kept adding new stuff until the very last minute. In fact, Jim got in trouble with me and the editor when he kept, stop the presses. We have to put this thing in. And so it's as up to date as it can possibly be for a book. And what's unusual about it is most books that you find don't have more interesting and up-to-date information than you'll find anywhere in the world. But there's a whole bunch of stuff in here that's not out. For example, people with Asperger's, high-functioning autism, they tend to need a dose of about 3 times the normal microdosing dose to feel anything and to have it work.
100%.
And we only learned that from experience. So
Yep.
we're very excited. The website has a place where you can ask questions or submit anonymously your own stories. And we're hoping that we'll get to a second edition in a few years and get to fix all the little mistakes that are in this one. And we're very excited to be on your show. I always enjoy talking with you. I hope we get a chance to meet someday in the real world.
It'll happen. We need to come out there anyway. It's been a while, and I've been telling High Street Mushroom Shop that I'm coming out there, so it's got to happen.
Yeah, James is a close friend. Yeah, and it's his images. Oh, these mushrooms are all taken by him on the cover. Those are all James's photographs.
See? Exactly. Yeah, I've been telling him I'm going to come out, so it's going to happen. Well, thank you so much, Jordan. And I'm excited about all this because we've seen this too. We worked in the underground for a long time. We tracked everything with everyone we ever worked with. And a lot of people continued to microdose because, again, we didn't say stay doing high dose. That's not the answer. And we have people living beautiful lives as a result of these master teachers. So for anyone watching, grab the book, even if you are curious or even if you're not sure or you've got some negative connotation from the past, grab the book, grab the Audible, check it out, because truthfully, if as a society we don't get more educated and remove some of this fear, we're going to deny this is a resource to a lot of people, that it could benefit not just medically, because it's not just a medicine. It is also for deeper connections, can be great work for couples, great for individuals, and even for families. So thank y'all for checking us out today. This is the Psychedelic Coach Podcast. And until next time, thank you so much, Jordan.
All right. Thank you so much.
Are you ready to answer the call to transform your life, to lead a movement? Listen, if you've been feeling it, the pull, that nudge, that call, it's not a coincidence, fam. We just wrapped the last Condor Approach live event. And the life you've lived, the struggles you've faced, the wisdom you've gained, all of it is leading you to one of our live events. The question is, are you ready to answer? Look, if you're here, then you're not like everyone else. You're a seeker, you're a leader, a healer, a creator. You've experienced your own depths, navigated your own shadows, and have emerged with these lessons that not only shape who you are, but could help other people. Deep down, it's time to take these lessons and use them to create something extraordinary, not just for yourself, but for the people you're meant to serve, whether in your own home, at your job, or as a coach. Look, the Condor Approach is not another training program or random live event. It's a movement. It's wrapped in a proven practical framework that's going to help those ready to step into their power and transform their lives to create ripples of change that extend beyond themselves. So if this sounds like you, go to condorapproach.com, get the information for the September event, because once it sells out, that is it. And this will be the first live event that we actually market. What that means is the on-site lodging is going to fill quickly. That means as of now, you can get set up on a payment plan so you don't have to worry about where you're going to stay. We don't have any stuffy conference rooms. You're not going to have that crazy blue light blaring at you. It's not another boring Zoom call. This is an interactive conversation. This is a transformation that is going to help you elevate the way you communicate and understand emotions. So, no, it's not just psychedelics and plant medicine. It's a roadmap for any life-altering experience, and it's a way to map your emotions, translate your body's language, and communicate with anyone in any situation. So whether the birth of a child, a sudden loss, a career change, divorce, or an ayahuasca experience in the jungle, this is the framework to show you exactly what to do and when so that breakthroughs last and breakdowns don't last so long. So I hope to see you in Austin, Texas this September 16th to the 20th if you want to build a business, or you can come for just 3 days and rock out the concepts the 18th, 19th, and 20th. So whether I see you all 5 days, 3 days, or you join the year program, I can't wait to see you in Austin. Because integration is not optional, but how you integrate is.